My name's Alan Moore. I write comics.
Remember the 5th of November.
I've been thinking lately about you and me,
You know, it's funny.
about how this is going to end, about who will end up killing who.
This reminds me of a joke.
The whores and politicians will look up and shout, "Save us!" And I'll look down and whisper, "No."
Hello and welcome to the Alan Moore Cast. I'm your host, Nathan Cabanis, and this week we're going back to the heady days of the 1990s with Alan Moore's runs on WildC.A.T.s and Youngblood, back when Alan Moore was a featured Image Comics creator. Our guest this week is a writer who has worked on Superman, X-Men, Iron Man, The Avengers, and more, in addition to creator-owned comics like Godland, Officer Down, Sex, and The Intimates. With his Man of Action cohorts, he's responsible for several hit cartoons, including Ben 10, which he recently relaunched in an all-new comic book series. His latest superhero comic, Terminal, is out now from Skybound Entertainment, co-written by Robert Kirkman and featuring a rotating art team of Andy Kubert, David Finch, and Art Adams. We are very honored to be joined by Joe Casey. Joe, thank you so much for coming on today, man.
My pleasure, Nathan. Happy to be here.
So congrats on Terminal number 1. I got to read an early copy and had a really great time with it. So I'd love to hear how that project came together. Was this an idea that Kirkman brought to you or vice versa?
Yeah, Kirkman had a sort of the vague notions of this idea first. And, we've been friends for over 20 years now at this point. But we never worked together. And for some reason, we felt like this might be something worth collaborating on. And it's been a long gestation period. I think we first started talking about it right before the pandemic. So I think I started writing in those first early months of the pandemic. So we're quite a ways ahead on scripts. And we were so far ahead that we thought, well, let's get some artists that need that kind of lead time to produce their best work. So we got Andy first. And once we got Andy, that was enough to blow me away personally. And then we got Arthur Adams, which unbelievable. And then Dave Finch came aboard as well. So it was like the dream team manifesting. I've been doing this for about 30 years now. And these artists generally knock me back on my feet. I just never thought I'd be working with artists like Arthur that I grew up reading, and was very, it made a big impact on me as a reader. So to get pages in my inbox from all three of these guys is amazing, truly amazing.
Yeah, I think this is Art Adams' first interior work in quite some time. So that's exciting in and of itself.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Well, another thing I'm curious to hear, and this kind of leads us into our main topic, but you look at Alan Moore's WildC.A.T.s and Youngblood today, and you can see how it fits into that turn of the millennium superhero movement. At the time, it really felt like we've done Watchmen, we've done The Dark Knight Returns, we've taken this concept apart from so many angles. Let's start rebuilding it into something new. Let's look at what worked, or what made this work in the first place, and rethink it for the coming 21st century. And I consider you to be a part of this with your own WildC.A.T.s run and a lot of the other superhero books you were writing at the time. But yeah, working on Terminal, were you consciously trying to bring some of that spirit to the book? Let's rework the superhero concept for a new age?
Well, I think it's more of an aesthetic that we're trying to, roll around in a little bit. That sort of 90s X-Men, over the top, operatic, bombastic, million ideas and a million subplots contained in one series. That's a very X-Men at its best type of vibe. It's weird because sometimes it's a conscious thing where, we're writing and we're specifically leaning into that tonality. And sometimes it's just what's in our DNA. Kirkman's a little bit younger than me. He comes from the generation after me. So he was a teenager when those, X books were really popping and the first wave of Image Comics was happening. I looked at that era with a little bit more detachment because I was a little bit older. I'd been through the 80s as a teenager and read Alan Moore in his, first burst of American fame. So when I saw him doing things like, an issue of Spawn or Spawn Blood Feud or, Bad Rock Violator, I was really like, what the hell is going on here? And then when he finally landed on WildCats, and I saw what he was doing there, I thought, okay, he's a writer who's finding his way in this new landscape. And I think WildCats was the most focused version of that aesthetic that he was doing. I think before all the Spawn stuff, I remember, I don't know if I've ever told this before, so not on a podcast, but when I first visited Extreme Studios in Anaheim, is Rob Liefeld's studio. This was probably early 1995. And a friend of mine was going down there. He had a mutual friend who was an artist that worked there. And so he took me down there and I was just trying to break in. And I don't know how I saw it, but was able to get Xerox copies of the first issue script of Bad Rock Violator. But it wasn't a script. It was a set of Alan's thumbnails, pretty detailed thumbnails, and sort of a dialogue script that kind of went with it. It was bizarre. I'd never seen a comic book scripted that way before. And I'd seen all kinds of methods. I'd seen the Harvey Kurtzman, Mike Barron method. I'd seen Alan's massive text scripts that he did for, Swamp Thing and Watchmen and From Hell at that point. But Alan, I'd never seen somebody do like such detailed thumbnails. And also on the page with the thumbnails was a written description of what was in the thumbnails. Alan not only just drew it, but he kind of wrote what he had drawn. And then separate to that was another document that was just the dialogue script, And I got to take a copy of that home with me. And I still have it in my archives because it was just such a weird artifact from this guy that I had, was such a hero of mine as a writer. But those works before WildCats, I always felt were, I don't want to say lightweight, but they were very pop comics. There was no real depth to them at all. It was Alan seeming like, hopefully having a good time, but certainly, cashing a paycheck. And WildCats kind of sits in that weird space between the Spawn work and the Liefeld work. And Supreme is really the dividing line because Supreme, really leaned into this retro thing, this Silver Age retro thing that Alan then carried on with, Judgment Day and Youngblood and the stuff that he did. Even, going into the ABC line was still kind of a retro vibe. But WildCats was this sort of anomaly where it wasn't the lighthearted fare that something like Spawn Blood Feud was, or Violator, Bad Rock Violator was. But it wasn't the retro thing that he would do with Supreme and then and beyond. It was kind of the most contemporary work that he was doing in the superhero genre at that time. And it was basically just, just to set a little context, James Robinson had done a quick little run before Alan came in on WildCats. And I really credit James with legitimizing that title. because James was a great writer too. And when he came in and started working on Wildcats and did like about 6 or 7 issues, he legitimized that title in a way that it hadn't for me. Because again, I wasn't a diehard Jim Lee fan. Those Image comics I bought when they launched because they were the thing to get, but I was not 14 years old. I wasn't taking them into my heart like I did the books that I read in the 80s. But Wildcats just seemed like he'd found this niche within this 90s superhero thing that was not lightweight but was not retro. It's just this very, it wasn't that it was sophisticated, but he was just telling a story in a very focused way. He wasn't necessarily trying to create a mood or evoke something. He just got a hold of these characters and leaned into the drama and leaned into the characterization and the relationships and the plot. There's that dual plot where there was the old Wildcats in space and the new Wildcats on Earth, and that sort of dual narrative was interesting. I mean, I also feel like there was a practical reason for that split because he was dealing with artists that couldn't necessarily keep a monthly deadline. So at some point it was, Travis Charest doing the outer space stuff and Dave Johnson doing the Earthbound stuff. So I feel like in hindsight, I feel like there was some necessity involved in that structure. But then again, I can't imagine how concerned Alan was with who was drawing these scripts anyway. I don't think he was necessarily writing to Travis's strengths or Dave's strengths or Matt Broom's strengths or even Jim's strengths when Jim would come in and do an issue or two. He was just telling this story. And I think he was around, for about 16, 17 issues, something like that. So he kind of told his story and bailed, and I've never really heard a lot of anecdotes about his time at WildStorm, that he had to deal with a couple of crossovers, or at least one crossover, this Fire from Heaven nonsense that you put a gun to my head, I couldn't tell you what the plot was, what the idea was, the conceit was. But, Alan was a trooper. He showed up and did his part. And I don't know if that eventually, if he went through that experience and was like, this is a bunch of bullshit, I'm going to wrap up my story and get out of here. I think for the most part, it holds up as a story, as a run of issues. And it's certainly, like I said, between James's work on Wildcats and Alan's work, it legitimized that title to such a degree that, a couple of years later, when I was up for the gig, I treated it as I was the inheritor of this book that Alan Moore had written, which again, I never thought I would be able to say that. That just seemed, I'd only been in the business at that point about 3 years full time. So to take on a book that Alan had written was like beyond my wildest fantasies before I turned pro. You know what I mean? It just didn't seem to be on the radar, but quite frankly, most of my career has been that way. So hindsight, I'm not that surprised.
One of the things we do to warm up here is to get everyone's personal Alan Moore stories. So, Joe, I'm curious, what was your first exposure to the work of Alan Moore?
It was Swamp Thing, because I was reading DC Comics at that time. They were kind of the main company I was reading. I was a young kid, and I was reading things like New Teen Titans, Ronin, Thriller, All-Star Squadron. It's kind of the stuff that was being touted as what they called the new DC at that point. There's no stopping them now. And DC would do these things called samplers, which were these free comics that were basically ads for their whole line. And The Swamp Thing double page spread that was famously in one of those samplers was like this prose section with, and Bissett and Tolman had done this kind of environmental drawing of the swamp, and I thought this was odd. I mean, I'd bought the Swamp Thing relaunch when it came out because the movie was coming out at that point, the Wes Craven movie, but it didn't really grab me. I bought like the first 2 issues and I was like, this is not for me. So I missed the whole first, couple of issues, or probably the first year of Alan on Swamp Thing. It just wasn't on my radar. And between the DC sampler and the what was starting to bubble up in the fan press, which I was reading at the time, Amazing Heroes, Comics Interview, Comics Journal, other pros were starting to talk about Swamp Thing. So I'd finally bought an issue. I'm not quite sure, trying to remember what issue it was. It was probably early on in the American Gothic story. It just as that was starting to happen. And I would go, and the first trade was one of the first trade paperbacks I ever bought, because it was a rare thing to get trade paperback collections back then. And then that was one that DC really got behind. So I bought that, and I was just all in on this guy at that point. And like a lot of people, I think the issue that really sold Alan as somebody I was going to be a fan of was that famous early issue of Swamp Thing, not the anatomy lesson, but the one where the Justice League shows up. The end of that first Jason Woodrue storyline, where the Justice League shows up and really doesn't do much, but they're Bissett and Tolman drew them all in shadow, and Alan had them speaking to each other in a way you'd never seen them talk to each other. Just elevated that whole Justice League concept at a time when the Justice League comic book was kind of goofy and not what I was reading at the time. So that was kind of my first exposure. And then because of the timing of it, it wasn't long after that Eclipse started publishing Miracle Man. And Miracle Man was, again, in the fan press touted as the greatest superhero comic that had come along in, decades, it seems like. So I was all over that. And it's weird, I have like weird sense memories of being a kid and, being like visiting my grandmother and, lying on the bed that I slept in there and reading, Swamp Thing 53, which was the Batman crossover issue, and things like that just have stuck with me my whole life. So he made a big impression on me. I mean, it really, because he was a pure writer and not like, I mean, I was a big Frank Miller guy too, but Frank Miller was a cartoonist fundamentally. And I was as much as I wanted to do comics, I knew by then that I was not going to be an artist. But Alan Moore was the first real example that I paid attention to of the writer aspect of comic books and how much influence a writer could have on the whole package. Because, again, as Alan was being talked about in the fan press, these anecdotal stories about how massive his scripts were and how detailed his scripts were and how he, every inch of the panel was described in minute detail. As a budding writer, it was fascinating to me. And so I glommed on pretty hard.
Well, let's get into our main topic today. After an extended absence from mainstream comics following his split with DC, Alan Moore made his return in a pretty unexpected way, writing for Image Comics. The hiring of comics' greatest writer by a publisher that was frequently criticized for its writing was an ironic twist that perhaps only Alan Moore himself could have pulled off. But the unlikely match wound up being a crucial part of Moore's overall career, if not all of comics history. Nearly all the Image founders brought in Moore for his stint on their characters and books, But it was Jim Lee who first hired the iconic writer for an extended run on his flagship WildCats title, Alan Moore's first work on a monthly book since Swamp Thing. Moore's run wound up lasting from issues 21 to 34, revamping the team in a similar everything you thought you knew was wrong vein to what he did with Swamp Thing, establishing a new status quo for the covert action teams. Soon thereafter, Rob Liefeld tapped Moore to write his Supreme series, which ultimately led to the writer revamping the whole Extreme universe when Liefeld left Image Comics to form Awesome Entertainment. Unfortunately, many of those plans never saw fruition when Awesome ultimately folded, as only 3 issues of Moore's Youngblood revamp were finished before the company went out of business. What I like about this era of Alan Moore is that he seems genuinely excited by the possibilities of monthly superhero comics again. He's put in a position where he's allowed to do basically whatever he wants with these characters, and he's really getting playful in what has become a rather unfamiliar industry.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I'd hate to put Alan Moore on the couch, but it's fairly obvious to me as someone who's been doing this for a while as well, that when you work in superhero comic books, you have the opportunity at times to indulge in a midlife crisis every now and then, you know? And it's a specific kind of midlife crisis where you're not going out and buying a sports car, you're not, finding some, younger woman or anything like that, the cliched. It's a creative midlife crisis where you have an opportunity to re-engage your younger self and re-examine the things that you loved as a kid, and I think that for Alan Moore, that was a lot of what was going on, and especially as he moved into the Supreme, Judgment Day, Youngblood, Glory phase, which again didn't last very long, and probably I can't imagine those phases that creators go through. They don't tend to last that long anyway. So it's ironic that circumstances cut off those awesome entertainment titles in the way they did. I think you were seeing with Supreme and specifically that he was starting to drift away from that retro thing. Those last issues of Supreme are really weird and metaphysical and not at all, even though their subject matter kind of taps into things where, there's that issue where Jack Kirby is God and all that stuff. But it was not like Supreme had been with those flashbacks that were very much cover versions of, Silver Age stories and Silver Age Superman and Superboy stories. And with Youngblood, and he had said this in interviews, which made it all the more fascinating to me, that he wanted Youngblood to tap into that kind of modern superhero team book energy that he saw, particularly in like the Wolfman Perez New Teen Titans, the early 80s. He had a take on that whole series where, he saw that that kind of team book could interact with the wider superhero universe that it was working in. And it kind of drew energy from that shared universe. And it also would refocus the reader's love of that shared universe. I just remember, thinking it was a very astute observation about what the Wolfman Perez Titans did and what he was trying to do with Youngblood was kind of make it contemporary, but very flexible in the kind of stories it could tell. I remember an interview when he was promoting the Awesome books where he was again talking about the Wolfman Perez Teen Titans, where in one issue they would be going to outer space, and in the next issue they'd be dealing with like teenage runaways. There'd be these tonal shifts that kind of superhero comic could contain very easily. And he and I was just breaking in at that point. This was 97, 98. So I was just starting, do my own work in superhero comics. And to see Alan have this, it wasn't an intellectual take, but it was very, like I said, it was very astute and it was very perceptive. And I'd certainly not put that much thought into the Wolfman Perez Teen Titans, even though I loved them when I was a kid. But to hear Alan's take on the function that they serve, now he was trying to tap into that same energy for Youngblood. Again, like he did with Wildcats, it legitimized this concept and this group of characters that had not had that much legitimacy, And at that point, you could argue had no legitimacy. They hadn't really been publishing Youngblood for a couple years at that point. So again, big lesson there to take as a fellow writer, which is, the oft told cliche, there are no bad characters, only bad writers. Alan's penchant for making those characters in particular seem like fully fleshed out was probably one of the last big influences I had before I went fully pro and just, sort of went my own way. So I'm in a way, I'm really grateful to Alan for doing those comics when he did, because it gave me a bit of a, it was sort of a booster rocket as I was just entering the field and writing superhero comics, modern superhero comics, to not take them for granted, not to underestimate them, it was very, very useful at that point for me.
And also, I talked to Dan Waters a couple episodes back, and he was opining about the anatomy lesson and how it kind of gave a false promise to a lot of comic book creators and what they would be able to do with these corporate characters.
Yeah.
But Moore found himself in a pretty unique position again with Wildcats. Much like Lin Wein let him rework one of his babies in the decade before, Jim Lee also pretty much gave him free rein to redo his flagship title.
Yeah, yes, I see the parallels. It's a little bit of apples and oranges, because with Swamp Thing, you're competing with Len Wein and Bernie Wrightson. And with Wildcats, it's not quite the same level of competition, they're, those early Wildcats are fine comics, but, they're no, 70s Swamp Thing, those are seminal comics in that genre. But to your point, it is true that I think, in a way, whether he was conscious of it or not, I can't imagine he wasn't conscious of it. But that's really part of Alan's brand, is the everything is wrong approach to these pre-existing characters. I would say at this point, maybe 30% of Alan's, work in comics is that, the other 70 being his own creations, and you can't really apply the everything is wrong thing to your own creations. But yeah, but so I think that he was going into these Image comics once he got his footing. Again, once he got through those initial sort of Spawn related miniseries, I think he realized that he could do what I assume he likes to do that. He likes to take something and go, okay, what's the potential here? What's the left turn I can take that's going to make this interesting for himself and for the readers? I just think that's his brand.
And it's also, the changes he makes are usually additive as opposed to subtractive. So you look at a lot of the stuff that maybe was inspired by his work, the grim and gritty trend, Hal Jordan goes crazy, kills a city, becomes a villain. Where do you really go from that?
Yeah. It's kind of again, I don't want to ascribe too many motives to Alan in this case, but it's a little bit of a piss take, in saying that premise doesn't work. Here's the new premise that works better. and it did work better. But at the same time, I mean, you have to acknowledge that Alan couldn't do what he did without the pre-existing conceit. In a way, he's dependent on takes on characters that might not be completely thought out, so that he can get in there and mine the gold that might actually be there. So it's a very codependent relationship in a way. He needs that pre-existing material in order to come up with something that to set against that. It's interesting to think about it in that way, because his run on Swamp Thing is, obviously legendary, and his run on Wildcats is, fondly remembered by those who read it. But they wouldn't exist without what came before. I don't know. That's kind of an interesting way to look at it now that I think about it.
Well, Moore's Youngblood was brief, but the few issues we did get are pretty incredible superhero books in their own right. I mean, a lot of that is Moore giving Steve Scroce the space to Steve Scroce the shit out of every page.
Yeah.
In interviews, and you touched on this earlier, but Moore always expressed that his early image work was him writing for a specific audience and what he thought that audience wanted, filtered through his own sensibilities. But by the time he takes on Supreme and the other extreme awesome characters, he's changed tactics, and instead now he's writing the kind of superhero comics that he wanted to see. More of that Silver Age sensibility, but maybe more modern, greater level of sophistication. And Youngblood feels like a classic teen book in that way, just on a larger scale, with bigger action. And I think that's something people don't always equate with Alan Moore. He can do commercial blockbuster comics with the best of them, maybe even better than anyone else.
Yeah, I mean, I loved those Youngblood issues too, and it had a lot to do with Steve's art. I mean, when I took a run at Youngblood, probably about a little over 10 years later, and that was the Youngblood I was trying to evoke. I mean, I even took characters from that lineup and used them. Now, I just realized, are we, when it comes to Youngblood and Alan Moore, are we going to talk about OJ Simpson and the OJ trial, or are we gonna gloss over that, or
Is this how it relates to Judgment Day?
oh yes.
We can get into it. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, it's the thing that I missed at the time, even though it's so obvious. And of course, Rob Liefeld's talked about it since, and I have so many feelings about it. So the one hand, I absolutely love the idea that Alan's at home in, England watching the OJ trial and being taken by the absurdity of it enough to sort of inject that into this, Judgment Day story that led into the Youngblood relaunch. That part kind of makes me laugh. I mean, it's kind of just funny to think about. And then you go deeper and you think, well, yeah, but to take the preeminent Black character in the Extreme universe and turn him into like this murderer who kills this, white female superhero and has this trial, and it's this whole, I mean, one thing I knew about the character Sentinel before Alan came around was that he was kind of the Iron Man of the Liefeld stable of characters, one of the leaders of Youngblood. So I remember at the time when I read Judgment Day, and they brought him back in issue 2 of Youngblood, he just seemed like a sort of crazy, over the top, angry villain. And it's a little, it doesn't age well, the whole scenario doesn't age well. And I don't know if, I go back and forth in my head about it, because I did a whole series called Blood Squad 7 last year that eventually tackled that story and tried to, in my point of view, set it right, dealing with time travel and, getting to a character before he's corrupted and all that nonsense. Because I just felt like it was maybe the one time in his whole body of work where I was not fully on board with his creative decision, and for somebody that was such a hero to me and such a influence on me when I was a teenager, especially. But that carried on through into the 90s as I turned professional. To have this weird difference of opinion was strange, and it's even stranger in hindsight because I had it's been 30 years. I have the perspective, but I still, as part of me is still, maybe I'm just fascinated by the whole thing. I mean, and to hear Rob Liefeld talk about it, it was like Alan put it right out there on Front Street that was his one of his influences on that storyline, and Rob just went with it. But it's an odd layer to this kind of otherwise kind of cool, frothy, pop comic that he was writing, that he would lay in, the specter of the OJ trial, which, I'm sure when it was going on over in England, it was it was just something to be witnessed. It was something to be observed.
It was like a curiosity, yeah.
Yeah, but here in America, it spoke to a lot of things that's part of the American story. So it's odd. I think it's maybe the only time, in my opinion, that his Englishness was not the most positive influence on the story, or on that idea, that detachment that he had naturally due to geography it just put that whole story in a strange, uncomfortable light.
Yeah. On the one hand, I love that twist and the way it comments on recent comics history of the time. Those early years of Image Comics are really just the fantasy of some drug-addled adolescent who learned all the wrong lessons from the comics he read. It provides an opportunity for Moore to poke fun at himself and Frank Miller and the kind of undue influence they had on comics for a while. But yeah, it is unfortunate that Moore uses Sentinel as that big bad. You've got this major black hero, the other leader of the team alongside Shaft, and he's ultimately revealed to be a drug dealer and a criminal. It definitely leaves a bad taste in the mouth.
Yeah, which that wasn't his original origin at all. Again, he was like a Tony Stark kind of genius guy who invented this suit and all that stuff, and Alan's take was a much more stereotypical kind of story, which was weird. And I know there was the twist of he got the book and he could rewrite the thing and all that kind of stuff, but that's not what sticks. That's not what lingers about that particular storyline. It is an odd thing.
Well, a lot of the WildStorm comics from this period really presage where comics would go overall, and really where popular culture goes in the 21st century. I've always said that you can trace a direct line from The Authority to the Avengers movie in 2012. But there's so many books that become highly influential later on. Stormwatch and The Authority, Planetary, Sleeper, Alan Moore's work in this period, your own Wildcats 3.0. I'm curious, what do you think it was that put WildStorm in this position to put out so many influential books in just a couple of years?
Well, I think that a couple things in the mid '90s when they got guys like James Robinson and Alan to write for them, and Travis Charest really exploded, and J. Scott Campbell exploded. They realized there was life at WildStorm beyond Jim Lee, which then led to bringing in Warren Ellis on Stormwatch, and that really kicked things off for this sort of turn of the century WildStorm period. And I've always thought that Jim sold WildStorm to DC at the very moment where WildStorm was going to be a major player because, there was the Wildcats relaunch, there was the ABC line, there was Warren's Authority and Planetary. I was doing my first work at WildStorm, Mr. Majestic, and it was a pretty hot stable of books. And then they sold to DC. Now it sort of continued on a couple years after that in terms of like the momentum was there, but it wasn't. Eventually DC came in and started dropping the hammer on certain titles and certain stories, and it wasn't as fun a place to write for anymore. But I mean, I agree with you. There's that direct line from the Authority of the Avengers movie. In fact, I would say the renaissance of Marvel Comics in the early aughts with the Ultimate line and Straczynski on Spider-Man and Grant Morrison on the X-Men, Garth Ennis on the Punisher, Mark Miller coming in doing Ultimate X-Men and the Ultimates. Really what Marvel did in the early aughts was basically just pull from WildStorm and Vertigo. Those two sources of talent makes what we call it new Marvel.
The Joe Quesada years, yeah.
Yeah, the Bill Jemas, Joe Quesada years. That's really all they did was they strip mine talent from Vertigo and WildStorm. Very simple formula, because that's what Marvel Comics became in the mid-aughts. It was just that synthesis of sort of Vertigo sensibilities and WildStorm cutting edge superhero sensibilities. And and like you said, the biggest expression of that aesthetic was the Ultimates, which led to all the Marvel movies, really. So there is so I agree with you 100%. There's that direct line from that work to kind of what's now taken over, or at least maybe not now, but for a while was totally took over pop culture. So it's interesting to think about. At the time, we didn't feel like we were at the epicenter of anything. We just were enjoying the freedom, and we felt like we were doing good work, and that the books were, for what they were cutting edge. I mean, we did feel like we were at the forefront of something. We just didn't foresee it getting co-opted quite so, soundly as it did by Marvel.
Well, it's amazing how those things go in cycles. It's like, you have this bunch of new creators come in and change the game. Then the corporate overlords get nervous and start pushing back on that. Things get stale. Then they realize they have to go back and find a new, fresh group of creators. And it's just like you can almost set your watch to it.
Yeah. I mean, that's the exploitation game, I mean, it's, what can we exploit and what can we monetize? And hey, there's some buzz over there. Let's go get that buzz so we can have that buzz and make that money. Not to be too cynical about it, but that's what it is.
Oh, no, for sure. As mentioned earlier, you had your own tour of duty with both WildC.A.T.s and Youngblood, where you follow up on some of the ideas and the characters laid down by Alan Moore. And you kind of continued some of that more recently with Blood Squad 7. So, as we wrap things up, I'd like to hear your overall thoughts on the Image Comics superheroes from that era. What was the attraction to those characters for you as a writer coming in later?
Well, there's a couple of strands to it, which one is that, and this is going to sound strange considering, how much I have revered his work and still do. When I came on to Wildcats originally, I actually thought it was a chance to do, again, what my heroes had done, which is take a pre-existing property that might have had, if not a negative reputation, just a non-reputation, and try to turn it around and turn it into something with some value, with some, creative merit. And Wildcats was that for me. I mean, despite the fact that James had done a run and Alan had done a run, at the time, this was a few years after those runs, so I felt like there was an opportunity to take a title and turn it around, much like Alan had done with Swamp Thing, much like Frank Miller done with Daredevil. I mean, there was a thing in comics that you could do if you found the right property and the timing was right and you had the right take. You could turn something that people thought had no juice left into it and give it some juice and give it some value. So that was, from a creative point of view, that was existing, of course. Now, from a personal point of view as a writer, Alan had made those characters come to life to some degree. You know, he infused them with some personality that I identified with and that I could build off of, which I certainly did. Youngblood less so. There wasn't as much Youngblood material there that I felt like I could, you know, like continue from. But it was still an opportunity to kind of take a title that people might have, you know, turned their nose up at and try to give it some legitimacy and try to give it some creative legitimacy. So those Image Comics superheroes, that was always the opportunity as far as I was concerned, because again, I didn't grow up with them. And so I didn't have a fan outlook on those characters. I had a writer's outlook. And so it was like a unique opportunity to kind of put certain attitudes and ideas that I had about superhero comics into practice. You know, it's like having theories and trying to find the laboratory in which to experiment and see if your theories bear out. Well, you need the right vehicle. So at that point, there were no real Marvel or DC characters that hadn't been revamped or rejuvenated by some creator along the line. There were just not any left that I could think of at the time. But these Image Comics characters were they were ripe for the picking. You know, they were the opportunity I was looking for. I think both the Wildcats characters and the Youngblood characters are solid characters. You know, the foundations are there. It just, you know, they just need a little love to bring out their potential. And it was, you know, it's the challenge that I wanted to take on. It was part of what I got into writing superhero comics to do. And looking back even now, in terms of work for hire comics, it was probably, I mean, people don't believe me, but the Youngblood run that I did in 2009, I think 2008, 2009, only lasted eight issues, but it was some of the most fun I ever had writing superhero comics. I was really in it. You know, I put everything that I had into that. And I did that with Wildcats too. I mean, I dedicated myself to making Wildcats this A-list title. And it was the Wildcats relaunch. I came in and sort of right after volume 2 had started, but it had already kind of started to go off the rails a little bit. You know, Travis Charest, who was the artist who launched that book, could not keep up his schedule. And it started out, people don't realize, it started out as a bi-monthly book in its first 6 issues. It wasn't until myself and Sean Phillips came on that it went to a monthly series. But, you know, my recruitment of Sean Phillips as the artist on Wildcats kind of tells you everything you need to know about what my ambitions were. You know, because again, like we were talking about what Marvel did a few years later, when I convinced Sean to do Wildcats, I was basically strip mining a Vertigo artist for this, you know, Image Comics superhero series. Very odd choice, considering that the look of Wildcats was based on either Jim Lee or Travis Charest. And here I was getting this kind of moody, you know, Vertigo Hellblazer artist, which is what he had done the longest run on at that point. And put him on this series was, you know, it was, I think some eyebrows were raised. But I knew what I was doing. That was the context I wanted to put that series in, because I felt like that's where it can make the most impact. And it, you know, I have to say it kind of worked. People looked at that series differently from that point on, and It gained a different kind of cachet. I'm proud of that as well.
Well, Joe, I think that should do it for this episode. Thank you so much again for coming on today. Alan Moore's Image Comics years are really fascinating when you look at them now, and certainly produced some of my favorite comics. So yeah, I'm always looking for an excuse to talk someone's ear off about them.
Well, I hope your listeners find it as fascinating as we do, because we could go on and on about this stuff.
There's got to be more of us. There's more than two for sure. Well, but before you go, is there anything you'd like to plug?
I'm not a big social media guy, but I do have a Substack that I do a weekly Substack, and it's free, so you'll get your money's worth. And I talk about my experiences in the business. And as a matter of fact, I've been doing a lot of WildStorm mining. I've opened up my archives and talk about some things that I've never talked about before. Things, pitches that never got approved, or things that got written that never saw the light of day. And if you like the inside baseball of the mainstream comic book business, then I would recommend checking out my Substack.
I'm a subscriber. I highly recommend it. Yeah, every week. It's always something worth reading.
Thank God.
Thanks once again to Joe Casey for coming on and talking with us today. Do check out Terminal Number 1 when you get the chance. It's a really fun superhero comic, and it's got an incredible rotating roster of artists, so I don't think you'll want to miss it. Next week, we'll be joined by Peter Hogan, the creator of Resident Alien, along with artist Steve Parkhouse. Peter is one of a very select few to have a co-writing credit alongside Alan Moore, as he was handpicked to help out with the America's Best Comics line. We'll get into Terra Obscura in particular, the Tom Strong spinoff that brought together many Golden Age heroes that have since fallen into copyright. Terra Obscura has always been one of my low-key favorites, so it was an absolute pleasure to invite Peter on to talk about that series and more. Until then, please do subscribe to the Alan Moore Cast on your podcast app of choice so you don't miss any upcoming episodes. The Alan Moore Cast is also available on YouTube at the dedicated Alan Moore Cast channel, so you can also check us out there if you're so inclined. And if you could leave a rating and drop a review, I'd greatly appreciate it. You can find us online at Instagram at the Alan Moore Cast for updates and announcements regarding future episodes. And that should do it for this week. Thanks to Michael Fluke for the theme music, and thank you so much for listening. Until next time, praise Glycon.